Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce's Ukraine War News Update for the 13th of July 2023. And you'll be happy to know that there's not nearly as much news today as there was yesterday. So this will be one shorter video than yesterday's two and the second one longer videos. Anyway, what do we understand of what took place yesterday in terms of Russian losses? This is from the Ukrainian General Staff. All the usual caveats apply. Someone yesterday said, "Why don't you mention that the Ukrainians make losses as well?" And it just shows they don't actually listen to my video, because yesterday I explicitly said that the Ukrainians will be losing heavy amounts too. It's just very difficult to keep an accurate picture of what their losses are, given how tightly the Ukrainians keep that data to themselves and how fanciful the Russian figures are. They're just absolutely nonsense, the Russian figures, and they're not worth repeating. So I go to these figures because they are at least somewhat accurate, and we can verify them, cross reference them with losses, visually confirmed losses, so on and so forth. And I have found them to be at least somewhat accurate. So 510 liquidated personnel is at the lower end of what we've seen over the last few weeks. I think it's kind of quietened down in terms of uh, the frontal assaults that we've seen on the front line. There is quite a lot of activity in Bakhmut, but generally, Ukraine are doing a lot of stuff from a distance. 2 tanks, 9 APVs, armored personnel vehicles, 23 artillery systems, and 4 multiple launch rocket systems is still a high number there. So that is a successful category for the Ukrainians. And then 6 anti-aircraft warfare systems. That is huge. I know a couple of book systems have been taken out, but yeah, that is a really high number in that category. 26 drones. That's not from last night. The night before there was a drone attack last night, but the night before was a larger one. 26 out of 28 drones from that attack. And then last night, I think there were 20 drones. All 20 were taken out, but a lot of damage caused by falling debris. 17 vehicles and fuel tanks. That's fairly high, and 5 pieces of special equipment. ISR, electronic warfare, that kind of stuff. That's intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance. So Ukrainians are going for these things specifically: artillery, anti-aircraft, and special equipment. And we can see that consistently in the consistently high numbers. I'm not going to show you this, but just to let you know that 85 dead bodies have been found by volunteer body collectors, basically going around in, I guess, newly liberated areas. This is around Bakhmut. 85 dead Wagner troops. So that is, when you start looking at these figures and see whether they are somewhat accurate, I think 236,040 is a very high liquidated personnel number. There are still questions as to whether that is definitely referring to dead people, whether that includes casualties of war. But nonetheless, Russians have lost a lot. The latest figures from the Medusa Media Zona analysis is that the Russians have lost at least, and that's not including DPR and LPR, the troops have lost at least 47,000. So somewhere between 47,000 236,000 is going to be the accurate number. People will argue all day long as to how accurate the general staff figures are. Just my conclusion is always Russia have lost a shed load of people, and they've lost more than the Ukrainians, a lot more than the Ukrainians. That's basically as accurate as I reckon I could be. Right, a few things to note. As I've mentioned, book. Here's one of the books being destroyed. I think there's footage of 2 being destroyed. Ukrainian army destroyed a Russian book in near the village of Salivka, south of Velika Novosilka. So this is this is HIMARS taking them out. So HIMARS really are doing the job of counter battery fire for taking out this stuff. Or it might not even be counter battery. They're just basically seeking out uh, equipment behind enemy lines with drones and then hammering it. So this is an air defense system, so it won't necessarily be like technically counter battery fire. Book missile system, just to let you know, that's what it looks like. It is fairly well. It's designed in the 70s. It, fairly widespread system. A standard book battalion consists of a command vehicle, target acquisition radar (TAR) vehicle, 6 transporter erector launcher and radar (TLAR) vehicles, and 3 transporter erector launcher TEL vehicles. A book missile battery consists of 2 TLAR, 4 missiles apiece, and 1 TEL vehicle with 6 missiles for a full complement of 14 missiles. It depends whether it's a battery, just a single one hanging out, so on and so forth. But that we've seen a number of these taken out for the last few days. It's called a Gadfly by NATO. That's its NATO name. Yeah. So let's see what the range is. It's a medium range system that replaced the Cub. I don't know what. Here we go. So target engagement zone, aircraft altitude 15 to 25,000 meters. So that's 15 to 25 kilometers. Range 3 to 42 kilometers for aircraft there. And for ballistic missiles, 2 to 16 kilometers, or in altitude, 3 to 20 kilometers in range. So that's how far it can go up, high, as to how far it can go sort of horizontally. So yeah, medium range system there. Anyway, we've seen a number of those taken out. Now this is where, just moving on to this, not particularly hits and losses, although this Kamaz has been lost. Sorry, Ural truck. So this is an Oshkosh M984A4 Hent recovery vehicle, putting a damaged Russian truck there, which will be used as a spare parts donor. This is the advantage that the Ukrainians have in terms of some of their vehicles compared to the Russians. The Russians don't appear to have this kind of capability, certainly in any widespread sense, whereas the Ukrainians have been given a number of these recovery vehicles, and that means that they can consistently recover even enemy vehicles they come across, to use them, get them repaired, or use them as spare parts donors, and that gives them an advantage over the Russians. Really important. So it strikes, as I said, there's not much to report. I could show you some footage of debris that's fallen in Kyiv. There has been some issue there, some casualties, and certain areas have fared fairly badly in terms of falling debris. The Ukrainian Air Force has said it shot down all 20 of the kamikaze drones. There are 2 Caliber missiles that also shot down, and apparently 1 Iskander landed and wasn't shot down, but not quite sure where that landed. There's no news about that yet. It could be that hit a military target and we just don't know about it. That's not unusual for that to happen. As I say, the Ukrainians keep fairly stum about hits that happen on their high value targets. So, moving on to other bits and pieces here. Tim White spreading this interesting opinion polls published in Russia today show support for the war in Ukraine is fading. When publishing any poll from the terrorist state, we should always bear in mind many people are distrusting with good reason, and may give the answer they think the Kremlin wants. So that you can imagine that these blue figures are going to be much higher than these polls suggest. So this is, in your opinion, now Russia need, in your opinion, now Russia needs on continue special military operation the territory of Ukraine or go to peace talks. So just sorry, that's a Google translation that is obviously struggling. So basically, should they continue the war or go for peace talks? And we have 45% of people saying they should continue the war, 44% of people saying it should go to peace talks. So that's almost a parity there in terms of suing for peace or continuing the war. And of course, that is a big difference from what we've seen in the past. That's the Russian original. And another question here, if you had the opportunity to go back in time and cancel the decision to start the war or the special military operation, would you do it or would you not? So 49% of people, so that is in red, and would you not? So in blue, so yeah, it is risen 7%. So people that would go back in time and basically not do the war. That option has risen 7% to 35% over the time since this has been asked in March of last year. 49% would not change. And of course, that's still in favor of the war in general. And that's what you would expect, but it's about the trends here, the movements over time. Right. I talked, I think I referenced this yesterday, but there's been a lot of talk about this. So this is Russian Major General Ivan Popov from the 58th Combined Arms Air Defense Army recorded a message saying that he was relieved from duty from his position. He says he is removed for telling the truth to the high command. He complains that they don't have counter battery capabilities and means of reconnaissance. He then accuses the high command of stabbing them in the back by beheading the army in the most trying times. Now, I think the story here is that he had his issues, went to Gerasimov, and then nothing was done, something like this. And then he threatened to go to Putin, and then Gerasimov just shunted him to the side. So this is what he says. And again, it's reflective of things not going well for Russia. So he basically gives his salutations. I put my thoughts together, and now you can be sure I'm relieved of duty. General Liamin arrived. He started commanding the army. I'm waiting for my further military destiny. It's change. Maybe some other offer for further service, he says. Make this a bit bigger so it's easier. I've been honest with you from the beginning. I've been honest with myself. Reduce the distance from the soldier to the marshal to all army gladiators. In this case, General Medvedev, because we are fighting together in the same way, die the same way, suffer the same way. It has gone the same way for all. I'm not making any distinctions. There's nothing between you, and I will always be honest since day one in our army. Obviously, the translation is not perfect. I'm telling you honestly, the situation is complicated with senior command. I could be silent or call things what they are. It's obviously going to call things what they are. I couldn't stay quiet. I am, in the name of you, the dead friends, don't have the right to lie. That's why I have identified problems about combat work and problems and issues about combat work, about the logistics. Bear in mind, this guy is really quite high up saying this. It's not just some mobic on the front line whinging about state of affairs, which is still obviously relevant, but this is coming from really high. I named the things that they are. I brought attention to the most important tragedy of modern war: no counter battery fire, no Russian intelligence and artillery recon. He says, and no Russian intelligence and artillery recon, and mass deaths of our friends, brothers from the enemy artillery, and other issues. I've spoken at the highest level, openly and very hard. In this regard, the senior commanders may have felt a danger. They may have felt threatened by what he's saying, and hastily, in one day, the Minister of Defence made a lightning order for me to be removed. Orders are issued to get rid of me. As many division and regiment commanders said, our army was not taken out from the front line by Ukrainian armed forces. We were hit by high command treacherously, and the vile beheading of the army is the hardest and most tense moment. But still, I'm in touch all the time for all soldiers and officers, soldiers in the army for all, 24/7. Any problems of domestic family, pumpkin, I don't know, combat any problem. Absolutely, we continue our work in the group. I'm always available. I'm honored to be with the same line with you, so on and so forth. So he's basically having a bit of a whinge there, but quite a serious whinge about the mass deaths of soldiers. So that is obviously happening, and he's aware of that. There's no counter battery fire, and there's no intelligence and recon. And those three things are obviously really, really important for being able to defend successfully against the Ukrainians and to attack as well. So that coming from a really senior military man is a problem. Now, not this is news, but this is a good analysis of what this talks to. So Tom Nichols here says, each time I see a story like this, it's a reminder that there is no actual Russian strategic goal in this war. The idea of defeating Ukraine and capturing it whole went down the tubes over a year ago. All that's left for Russia is fighting over map squares. Now, as I keep telling you, I've wrote an article about this in April last year and saying exactly this, and it's so obviously the case, this. And he elucidates it really, really well. Tom Nichols. So this leaves Russian forces not knowing what to do, even if they could win on the ground in various areas, which they're not. As we teach at US war colleges, operational victories do not automatically translate to strategic success, especially if you have no idea what your goals are. Now, remember, Igor Girkin came back from the front line saying the Russian soldiers don't know what they're fighting for. They don't know what the objectives are. The same for the kind of NCO cadre, as it is in the Russian army. They, until you get to the very highest levels, no one really knows what they're fighting for. And I don't know, even at the highest levels, that they know what their objectives are, because they have no achievable objectives apart from, as we go on to see here. I suppose, quote, do not keep losing territory in areas you invaded is a, scare quotes, goal, but it's by definition temporary. Quote, capture Kiev and force a surrender was the Kremlin order, but that plan went to shit. Russian forces now find themselves fighting because those are their orders. The Ukrainians, on the other hand, have a clear goal: expel the invaders and restore control over national territory. The Russian goal has degraded to, quote, don't let them do that, or at least not too fast. Because Moscow is paralyzed and dumbfounded that its only plan failed instantly. Absolutely bang on this. I mean, as I said, I wrote this article in April last year. This means that Russia is going to keep feeding men into the meat grinder, but Putin doesn't care. He's trapped now and has to keep inflicting murder on Ukrainians and bleed his own army because he doesn't know what else to do. This is a sunk cost fallacy. You're in for a penny, in for a pound. You're there. Pulling out now is political suicide and an existential threat to Putin, so he has to stay in. Prigozhin seemed to grasp this, but Prigozhin's not exactly Clausewitz either, and mostly he was pissed that his guys were getting shafted by the defense ministry. These are not very bright guys, as the saying goes, and things are out of control. The key problem now is that there's nothing to negotiate over. Even things Russia claimed to want, keeping Ukraine out of the West's orbit, are no longer possible. The bigger problem is that Russia itself now has no idea why it's fighting, and you can't negotiate with that. You can't negotiate with a state whose only goal is revenge for its own failures. All you can do is keep making them pay the price until they withdraw. Wow. I'm going to read you those last two tweets again, because this is basically where we're at, where Ukraine are at, where Russia are at. The key problem now is that there's nothing to negotiate over, even things Russia claimed to want. So, given what's happened in NATO, like NATO expansionism was an issue. That's happened, and it's going to continue happening, and there's nothing Russia can do about it. Keeping Ukraine out of the West orbit are no longer possible. The bigger problem is that Russia itself now has no idea why it's fighting, and you can't negotiate with that. Like, how do you sit down with Russia and say, right, we need, like, you want this, and we want this, so let's argue over this, and we'll meet somewhere in the middle. If actually we don't know what you want and you don't know what you want, so we can't even start that opening sentence there is not relevant. Like, well, you want this, we want this. Well, you want, what do you want? Why are you here? What's going on? You can't depose Zelensky's government now like you planned in that first week. That can't happen. So what are you doing here? What's going on? You're only here because you pumped all of your it's a sunk cost fallacy. You pumped your money into this, and now you're like, well, we've put in all this effort and wasted all these lives already, so we've got to get something. What is that something? Oh, it's just nonsense. You can't negotiate with a state whose only goal is revenge for its own failures. That is so well elucidated. All you can do is keep making them pay the price until they withdraw. Yeah. Such a folly, such an expensive, wasteful, uh, terrible folly. Canada has also, so now we're moving on to military aid. Canada has pledged more aid to Ukraine to the amount of $410 million. That was announced by Trudeau at the NATO summit. What else? Japan has announced new aid to Ukraine in the form of drone detection systems. Again, announced at the NATO summit. Almost 5,200 Ukrainian military personnel have already received training in France, said the French Minister of Defense. 1,600 were also trained in Poland. By the end of the year, there will be almost 7,000 of them. So thank you to France and Poland there. Australia will provide a new package to Ukraine, and that will include 30 Bushmasters. These are protected mobility vehicles. Uh, they are decent vehicles, they're highly regarded, as far as I understand it. So that's great that they'll get another 30 of them. In fact, I think they've wanted them for some time. Swedish supplied Stridsvagn 122. These are customized Leopard 2A5s somewhere in Ukraine. So these are now there in Ukraine. So Ukraine now has 10 of these, which is fantastic. I think they've got thermal camouflage on them as well, as far as I remember. Norway will transfer another NASAMS support package to Ukraine. It will include 2 additional fire control centers, 2 launchers, and spare parts, which will ensure the endurance, redundancy, and flexibility of the already transferred air defense equipment. I don't know it's going to ensure the redundancy. Not sure that's the right word. Nonetheless, a journalist asked Biden whether he's still considering the transfer of ATACMS to Ukraine. Yes, but they already have the ATACMS equivalent, and what they need is artillery shells. We're working on that, Biden replied. This is the idea that they've asked for them, but and we've given, or we as allies have given them equivalents. I don't know if he's specifically referring to Storm Shadows. They aren't strictly equivalent because ATACMS can be fired from the ground. Storm Shadows had to be fired from an adapted airplane in the air, and there are differences in the speeds of these missiles. And I think ATACMS can hit moving targets, where Storm Shadows less so. So there are some differences that are significant there. What they need is artillery shells, and I think that's if it was this. I mean, the question is that false dichotomy? In other words, you're saying either this or that, rather than, do you know what? Both. They can have storm shadows, and they can have artillery shells, and they can have ATACMS. Let's do it. So I think that's presenting a false dichotomy. But as we heard yesterday from Reznikov, or was it Kuleba? I think it's Reznikov, saying there are objective reasons why the US haven't given ATACMS. So I think we just have to put it down to the fact that actually there appear to be good reasons why ATACMS haven't been given. Otherwise, I think they probably would have been given. I don't think it's just a case of the US being recalcitrant, being particularly difficult in this area for some non-escalatory reason. If it is, that's really annoying. But I can't. So therefore, I can't imagine that it would be. Russian Defense Ministry, Wagner hands over 2,000 pieces of military equipment. This is a bit of a worry. This will include, hundreds of tanks, lots of varied equipment that suddenly the Russian army will have access to. Of course, they previously did have access to this via Wagner. So I guess it's not like this is equipment that's suddenly available that wasn't at all available previously. It was available, it's just being used by Wagner. Although they didn't seem to use all that many pieces of mechanized equipment. They much preferred the use of humans to do their offensive jobs. So I don't know whether this is equipment that was kind of behind the lines and now can be brought to bear for the Russians. So it might be a bit of a worry. Right, Frontline quickly. There's not too much information on the Frontline as ever. I keep saying this every day, but just it is thin on the ground. So Ukraine have announced that they've made advances to the south of Bakhmut. Ukrainian military has advanced on Bakhmut's southern flank and solidified newly taken positions, according to Hanna Maliar, Deputy Defense Minister. This is around Klishchivka, no doubt, flanks of the trench bulwark northwest of Klishchivka. The Ukrainians have advanced there. You can see the tree line and the tree line over here to trench lines, but I'm pretty sure they were already there yesterday. as far as my mapping is concerned. Spokesperson for the Eastern Group in Cherevati explained that Kadyrov's troops were seen near Klishchivka but retreated after suffering heavy losses. So this is to confirm that the Kadyrovites were sent to help the Russians, did take heavy losses, and could well have been the members of the Russian armed forces in those videos that I showed you but didn't show you, concerning quite a number of troops that were trying to advance and then were hammered by artillery. And basically did a runner, taking huge losses. The battles with them clearly showed that their business is police duties, because as soldiers they have no value. Ouch. Having suffered losses, they retreated. I think if they try to go into battle with the Ukrainian brigades again, they'll be completely defeated. Oof, that's literally fighting talk. Russian source Polk 105 in the Robotna area in the Orikhiv direction. A tank battle is going on at this moment. This was last night. The enemy is trying to break through our first line of defense. The guys fight off the attack from burning light. I don't know what that means, from burning light, but yeah, fierce battles going on, a tank battle as well. And talking about Robotna, Russian footage appears to confirm that Ukrainian forces were able to occupy portions of the main Russian defensive trench line on the northeast flank of Robotna. I was saying that they must have advanced past that now. Looking at activities taking place, where the trenches are on the map, and where we've seen pieces of equipment lost by the Ukrainians. So this would confirm this is Russian footage, first-person view, drone footage. Shows Ukrainian infantry has captured a significant fortification in front of Robotna, in exactly the areas I was talking about. So that is good news for the Ukrainians there, but these things will no doubt come at a cost. And near Zerebianki, which is to the west of Robotna, fighting continues. Ukrainian troops seem to have taken over most of the Russian fortifications to the north. Footage shows that Ukrainian troops have to retreat due to Russian mortar and artillery fire, but there is no close combat. Interesting. Now, what this kind of stuff signifies is how slow it is and it will be taking these positions. Now, they are not committing huge forces, which is also why it's going to be somewhat slow. They are just doing probing attacks to find weaknesses, but there don't seem to be any obvious weaknesses along the front. And so therefore, when it comes to taking these positions, it takes just a long time to take them. That's just the nature of the beast. Right, going on to geopolitical things, and obviously this is going to concern almost exclusively NATO. Instead of the invitation to NATO membership expected by Ukraine, the Allies agreed on a three-part package of support. It includes a NATO-Ukraine Council. So this is this kind of bridging council between, I guess, now and the next summit in Washington that will, put in place things that need to be done for accession for Ukraine to NATO, whilst also giving the assistance Ukraine needs. Long-term military assistance and the abolition of the required membership action plan. So although they've got rid of the membership action plan, which is how you got into NATO, so we're going to get rid of that, but we're going to replace it still with conditions. I guess the thing is that those conditions will be bespoke to Ukraine rather than be generalized roadmap that any country needs. Joe Biden. This is a bit of Joe Biden being a bit quality here.
President Zelensky, how soon after the war would you like to be in NATO?
If you didn't hear that, as President Zelensky, how soon after the war would you like to be in NATO? And then Joe Biden answers this.
How soon after the war would you like to join NATO?
An hour and 20 minutes. You guys ask really insightful questions.
I love his sarcasm there. An hour and 20 minutes. You guys ask really insightful questions. How soon after? Of course, straight away, of course. Nonsense. But yeah, bit of a pointless question. But yeah, Biden just showing a bit of exasperation there. This is Shashank Joshi talking about what came out of the NATO summit. So NATO did not give Zelensky everything he wanted. And this is what and I'll just dip into this. Ahead of this week's summit in Vilnius, Ukraine and its closest allies, including Lithuania, the host, and its neighbours in Eastern Europe, had hoped the Allies would offer Ukraine a clear and credible post-war pathway into NATO. They were haunted, and this is well worth remembering, actually, and I hadn't thought about this. They were haunted by the ghosts of a previous summit in Bucharest in 2008, which had declared that Ukraine will join NATO without saying how and when. So this is why Zelensky and the Ukrainians were so adamant that they needed a firm commitment in terms of that roadmap, that timeline, because they've been burnt before. They've been told, you'll join NATO, no problem, back in 2008. And 2014, they had Crimea and the Donbass annexed. Where were NATO then? In Vilnius, leaders did indeed affirm that, quote, Ukraine's future is in NATO, and said that it would not need to jump through the hoops of a, quote, membership action plan or map. But hoops there still will be. Quote, we will be in a position to extend an invitation to Ukraine to join the alliance when allies agree and conditions are met, declared the members in distinctly nomic fashion. Concerns about corruption in Ukraine loom large for some NATO countries. The pledge was Bucharest minus, suggested Samuel Charap of the RAND Corporation. At the summit, the mood among many Eastern European experts and officials bordered on melancholy. So that was certainly at the beginning of the summit. Mr. Zelensky, whose mid-summit tweet that the decision was absurd, was thought to have irritated American officials, later struck a more emollient note. Quote, the results of the summit are good, he suggested, adding that, quote, clear signals that NATO membership will happen were heard confidently today. So and I reported this yesterday, he annoyed some people by saying it's all absurd and things need to be done differently. And that annoyed a lot of people in these back rooms. And then he came out subsequently saying, I think he said the word gratitude 4 times in one speech. But there were also signs of friction among friends. America deserved gratitude from the world for its support for Ukraine, argued Mr. Sullivan. And this prompted, I guess, Zelensky to change his rhetoric. Clearly annoyed by accusations of insufficient resolve. Quote, people want to see gratitude, agreed Ben Wallace, Britain's defence secretary, recalling that he had driven 11 hours to Kyiv only to be handed a wish list of arms. We're not Amazon. Right, let's just dip into this. So I mentioned this yesterday, that Ben Wallace, he wound some pro-Ukrainian people up, but he is also basically just exposing what people thought behind the scenes, some of these other politicians. So it's not that he was wrong in saying that. He might be wrong to say that out loud, but he was observing, partly what he was saying was observing how other people felt. So here, subsequently then, Rishi Sunak, UK's Prime Minister, came out and distanced himself from Ben Wallace, interestingly. So there's lots of stuff going on here. Rishi Sunak distances himself from Ben Wallace's remarks about Ukraine, that Ukraine should show more gratitude. So Rishi Sunak has distanced himself from Ben Wallace's suggestion that Ukraine should show more gratitude to the West, insisting that Zelensky has done so on a number of occasions. Defense Secretary raised eyebrows on Wednesday when he suggested that Ukraine should be more grateful for support from allies after Zelensky hit out at NATO earlier in the week for failing to offer a timeline for Ukraine's accession to the alliance. Speaking on the sidelines of the NATO summit in Lithuania, Mr. Wallace said some US politicians had complained that, quote, we've given $83 billion worth of whatever, and we're not Amazon. There's a slight word of caution here, which, whether we like it or not, people want to see gratitude. My counsel to the Ukrainians is sometimes, look, you are persuading countries to give up their own stocks, he said. And yes, your war is a noble war, and we see it as you waging a war not just for yourselves, but for our freedoms. But sometimes you have to persuade lawmakers on the Capitol in America, Capitol Hill in America. You have to persuade doubting politicians in other countries that it is worth it, that it is worthwhile, and they're getting something for it. So what he was saying was kind of realpolitik. Is like, yeah, whether we like it or not, some people like to hear gratitude. So what Ben Wallace is saying is like, you should show gratitude. It's not saying, look, I, Ben Wallace, and the UK, we want to hear you being grateful for what we're doing. He's saying there are some others around here that want to hear gratitude. So maybe you should say that, and then you're more likely to get what you want, type thing. Whether it's worth saying that, I don't know. But actually, maybe outing some of these issues then leads to these issues being resolved more obviously and more explicitly. Whereas if these things simmered under the surface, then they don't get resolved. It's like any relationship you have, like real human relationships. Sometimes you need to like have that argument to get everything out there and clear everything up. So perhaps it was worth Wallace saying this, although some people have really criticized him for that. But then some people are criticizing Ukraine. So, I'd say get it all out. So on and so forth. People talk about lectures on gratitude and some people being unhappy, so on and so forth. Anyway, back to the NATO summit as a whole. Others, though, offered a more sanguine assessment of Ukraine's situation. Quote, Ukraine is now closer to NATO than ever before, insisted Jens Stoltenberg. Gabrielis Landsbergis, Lithuania's foreign minister, said that Vilnius summit would be a bridge to NATO summit next year in Washington. And Boris Pistorius, Germany's defense minister, suggested that the simplification of the accession process would speed things up. Quote, once the war is over, this can go very fast. Some experts and officials at the summit suggested that NATO membership was being held back because it would be necessary. This is really, really interesting, important. I don't know if this is definitely the case. Some experts and officials at the summit suggested that NATO membership was being held back because it would be necessary as a bargaining chip later. For instance, to help persuade Mr. Zelensky to make concessions as part of a settlement with Russia. I hope we don't get to the point where we are saying to Zelensky, if you give up Crimea, then you can be part of NATO. I hope it doesn't come to that. Zelensky did not leave empty-handed by any means. On the sidelines at NATO summit, the G7 countries issued a joint declaration setting out general principles on how each state would offer enduring support for Ukraine. The document promised to work towards specific bilateral long-term security commitments and arrangements that will build up Ukraine's armed forces, including with air defense, artillery, armored vehicles, and warplanes. A coalition of countries will begin training Ukrainian pilots on F-16 jets next month. The declaration added that Russian state assets abroad would remain, quote, immobilized until Russia pays for the damage it has caused to Ukraine. I love this. So this is very clearly saying that Russian foreign assets will be frozen and will be used until Russia pay reparations. So it's not that they're going to liquidate those assets and use them to pay for reparations, I think, but it's we have $100 billion worth of assets. You need to pay $100 billion to Ukraine, and then we'll give you that stuff back. That's how I understand it. The strongest commitment to date to force Russia to pay for Ukrainian reconstruction. But they said that if, after this war, Russia attacked Ukraine again, allies would immediately consult with Ukraine and offer swift and sustained security assistance, including modern military equipment across land, sea, and air domains. It's now up to the individual allies to flesh out the pledges. Quote, you could expect more British troops in Ukraine after this conflict than you did before, suggested Mr. Wallace. We have seen Turkey's Erdogan withdraw his blocking of Sweden's bid for NATO membership on July the 10th once Turkey's parliament completes ratification. I would warn, though, that Turkey's parliament is closed now for the summer and they won't be able to ratify that till the autumn. So that won't be like super immediate. Meanwhile, the Nordic states have made a really nice, concise statement. We, the leaders of Nordic countries, remain unwavering in our support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity with its internationally recognized borders. Building upon the joint statement of the Nordic Ukrainian Summit in Helsinki, we pledge to continue our support for Ukraine as long as it takes. To this end, we welcome the G7 joint declaration of support for Ukraine, which is to say to Russia, hey, we're in this for the long haul. It's really, really important. Gary Kasparov, who's kind of trotted over from the States as kind of Mr. Russia, says, despite total support in NATO for admitting Ukraine, the US has blocked a clear path without real explanation. This opens a door to conjecture about what was discussed between Biden and Putin in their conversations. And by the CIA's burns in Russia, what don't we know? So he's actually being, this is a bit of a stab in the back for the NATO narrative, I guess. Anyway, moving on. The question now is not in unlocking new weapons, because we did unlock them. The question is ensuring the sustainability of deliveries and fast-tracking delivery of recently promised weapons, Ukraine's foreign minister said. So this is really important as well. It's like, okay, we pretty much got all the weapons we want. Yeah, we're getting airplanes and it's not as soon as we like, and we don't have ATACMS, but we've got other long-range missiles. So now it's about getting more of this stuff on a consistent basis. So it's about artillery ammunition, just loads and loads and loads of it. Continued tanks, continued APCs, and IFVs and so on. Philip O'Brien says, I know there's a lot of skepticism by some who strongly support Ukraine, but on balance, the NATO summit needs to be seen as a very successful one for Ukraine, and the future just marred by very poor statement. Zelensky releasing a very positive summary of Vilnius. So Zelensky's kind of closing statement is, we are returning home with a good result for our country, and very importantly for our warriors, a good reinforcement with weapons. It is very important. For the first time since independence, we have formed a security foundation for Ukraine on its way to NATO. These are concrete security guarantees that are confirmed by the top 7 democracies in the world. Never before have we had such a security foundation, and this is a level of the G7. On this foundation, we will build a new legally binding architecture of bilateral security treaties with the most powerful countries. Very importantly, during these 2 days of the summit, we have put to rest any doubts and ambiguities about whether Ukraine will be in NATO. It will. For the first time, not only will the allies agree on this, but do all allies agree on this, but a significant majority in the alliance is vigorously pushing for it. Never before have the words "you are equal among equals" for Ukraine from other NATO members sounded so truly meaningful. Now everyone understands that this is a fact, equal among equals, and we will definitely reaffirm this fact with our victory and with our accession to NATO. Previously, Russia's rulers wanted to have their own fence in front of NATO's door. We have left this Russian ambition on the margins of European history, behind the fence of our unity in Europe and more broadly in the free world. I am grateful to all those who have worked for unity in Vilnius now. It's a really strong, positive message from Zelensky there. A Kremlin spokesperson, Dmitry Peskov, stated that G7's provision of security guarantees to Ukraine, which was announced on the second day of the Vilnius summit, is potentially very dangerous and an encroachment on Russian security interests. Right, this is kind of where I want to leave you today, because goodness me, I've been speaking too long. I said it'd be short. Just have a thought about what Russia think here, and how they must see. Do they have any self-awareness? I see this a bit like, I guess, if you're in a class, right, and you're being a bit of a dick, and you're just saying stuff to try and get a laugh out of everyone, and then the class is, teachers giving the class some issue, some hassle, and everyone turns around to you, says, "Shut up! Stop being a dick," and you're like, "Okay, so like everyone here doesn't like me right now," and then you turn to your best mate like G, who normally supports you, and G's sitting there going, "Don't look at me." Like, what do you then think? Like, as a kid in that classroom, you must have some kind of self awareness as like, "Oh man, like if everyone thinks I'm a douche, then maybe I am. Maybe I should just shut up right now." Yeah. S- When you've got the whole world pretty much, or at least the most powerful nations in the world, bar China, but again, China's saying nothing, getting together and organizing how to shut you up, like, and saying those guys need to shut up, then how must Russia be thinking now? Surely they must have some kind of self-awareness that things aren't looking good for them, that they aren't the good guys, that, I don't know, are they that ostrich-like to still think that this this crusade they're on is the right thing to do? I don't know, but it's sunk cost fallacy. They're in now. They can't get out without that being the end of Putin. I don't think so. That's why some analysts have said for some time that this war won't come to an end with Putin in charge. If Putin is in charge, Russia will stay in Ukraine, because it's intrinsically linked. The success of this whole thing is intrinsically linked to Putin's existential continuation, right? So it's not that Russia can win, but the longer it goes on, the longer Putin can rule in Russia. And it's a bit of a problem, and I'll leave you with this. It's a bit of a problem when on the council building in the capital of Lithuania, where the NATO summit is meeting, they have this written in massive letters: Putin, The Hague is waiting for you. Imagine you're that kid in the class, and on a whiteboard bunch of the other kids have written, detention's waiting for you. Keep doing that, detention's waiting for you. How would you feel? Well, maybe there's the entrenchment, like, no, sod the lot of you, sod you, it's just me on my own. And I think kind of that's where Putin is at the moment. Right, screw the lot of you, I'm just going to continue being a dick. I don't care what anyone else thinks. Because you're that lost. You're that far in, you're that lost. The anxiety levels have reached that high that you're just like flailing. And you continue with that behavior. I think maybe that's the more I think about it, the more this analogy kind of works. Anyway, let me know what you think. Thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe, and share. Take care. I'll speak to you later.